Hey y'all, welcome back to our, chapter 8.5 lecture. If you kind of remember in chapters 7 and 8, we went over interpersonal communication and conflict. And so essentially what this lecture is going to do is go over how we can manage that conflict. And this isn't in the textbook, this is in the guidebook, as you can see. And so the guidebook just goes straight through, and it'll be somewhere around chapter 8 right before we get into informal presentations. So we're going to go over conflict management styles, and managing interpersonal conflict. So why is understanding conflict important? So it's impossible to avoid. It's what all relationships have in common. And as relationships become more intimate, some have claimed that the probability of conflict increases. And so if we return back to the onion model that we learned, that model kind of argued that the more you learn about each other, the more intimate you become. And this is basically building on that, saying the more intimate you become, the more likely conflict can arise. So if you think about it, all of these examples kind of showcase how the more they kind of got closer, the more they sometimes would fight. So for example, in the office, everyone has their little tiffs, and yes, you can resolve that fight leading to a more intimate relationship, but there will still always be little conflicts. And so there are different types of conflict management styles. This will take you to a link if you end up wanting to watch it on your own time. But there's three main styles that will be non-confrontational, confrontational, and cooperative. And so I like to go over this in a bit more detail because it's fun, and it's fun to see like what kind of style you fit into versus other people. So as we kind of mentioned, that non-confrontational style, this is going to be just like the typical strategies are indirect, usually using avoiding and withdrawing, silence, concealing feelings, and glossing over difference. This is basically ignoring any issues. So this is going to be the person who is mad at you, but you are going to sit there and ask them what's wrong 10 times, and they're not going to tell you, but obviously there's an issue. Then on the other side, we have confrontational. I'm also super sorry if I sound congested. I don't know why I was hit really hard with allergies this morning. I'm thinking it's just coming with the weather changes. But back to confrontational conflict styles. These are going to be direct. They're going to argue, and taking control and advocate only for one's position. This is going to be the more aggressive style, as you can see, more in your face versus to the back. Ideally, you want to be somewhere in the middle at cooperative. And this is also going to be with direct strategies, but this is going to be integration and finding a solution through compromise. So instead of completely avoiding the situation or becoming too overly involved in it, the cooperative style basically really targets, okay, what's the problem and how can we solve it? Instead of perhaps just making a situation worse. So as we kind of mentioned in the last lecture video, there are a couple different types of conflict. I didn't include all of them, but here are some that I mentioned there. And again, these are all in the textbook that you can look at and get a better understanding, more in depth. But pseudo-conflict is just any conflict stemming from a lack of understanding. A simple conflict is just a different over ideas, definition, perception, or goals. Ego conflict, this is where it gets a bit more intense and it becomes conflict based on personal issues, self-esteem, serial arguments, obviously conflict that focused on the same issue at least twice. So the first time you didn't really get over that argument. And then irresolvable conflict is a conflict that one or both parties deem is impossible to resolve. And as you can see, it kind of gets more extreme as you go down. Like a pseudo conflict is pretty common. It's basically any like misunderstanding that can occur, leading to more aggressive feelings. Maybe not aggressive, but unresolved question mark, negative feelings. So how should you handle conflict when it happens? Obviously, as it's impossible to avoid, how can we as people go about managing that conflict with others? And so the guidebook offers us PUGs, and not PUGs, unfortunately. They're very expensive, so your guidebook can't give you that. But what it can give you is this model for managing conflict. And so essentially, what you will kind of do is go through the stages of describing a problem, achieving understanding, identifying goals, brainstorming solutions, and selecting the best solution. So first, you want to start with describing the problem. So describe the other person's behavior rather than evaluate the person, using I statements rather than you. You've seen this before, right? We did a whole assignment on this a couple weeks ago. So you guys should be pretty skilled at using I statements. And so this is self-disclosing your emotions or feelings. And so here with the image of the dishes, you would basically just kind of say, obviously it's a roommate issue, someone's not doing the dishes. There is a way to kind of have that conversation. So instead of being like, you never wash the dishes, you leave this place a mess, it would be, I don't appreciate that you don't do the dishes quicker, or I feel that blah, 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 blah. Instead of placing the blame on someone else, just kind of let the person know how their actions are impacting your feelings, if that makes sense. All right, and then it's achieving understanding. Once you figure out what the problem is, you're able to kind of come to this mutual understanding of, you know, do you understand why I feel this way? Do you get what I'm saying? And making sure that they really understand where you're coming from. And the important part of these steps is to not move to the next one until the step before is properly finished. Otherwise, you're just kind of building a sandcastle that's going to get knocked over by the tide. So you want to make sure that each party has like a good understanding of the problem, and that, and see, you can kind of emphasizes it here, but if there's not mutual understanding, then you need to return to step 2 and adapt, like we went over in Principle 5, until mutual understanding is achieved. Sometimes you'll hear people say, I don't know what the big deal is, and it's kind of just, if the other party doesn't even understand what the problem is, then there's no way that they're going to be able to assist in finding a solution. And so the next step, the third step, is talking about goals. So both of you should be able to basically have this collaborative building of what you would like to see in the future. So going back to that example with the dishes, you can kind of, you know, I would like, for example, you could say, I would like the dishes to be done more often. It doesn't make me happy. What if we make sure that dishes are no longer in the sink for more than 2 days? And then the other person is like, okay, I am busy, and so every 2 days doesn't really work, but can we do every 3 days? And it's just kind of like figuring out what can be done to reach a compromise. And so once you kind of figure out what you want the goal to be for that problem, you'll kind of generate some solutions, piggyback off of other ideas. Obviously, the more solutions that you have, the more likely a solution will arise. So for example, you both agree on like dishes should no longer be in the sink for more than 3 days, and so you guys create a chart, you make a planner, you do blah 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 to kind of create these solutions that will help you achieve your goal of keeping the dishes out of this, cleaning the dishes before they're in the sink for too long. And then after you generate enough solutions, you will be able to pick the best one. And again, all of these aspects have a lot of compromising aspects, give some, take some. So for example, Matt spends little time with his girlfriend Katie because of his demanding job. Katie's career is equally demanding, but she finds time for Matt. After discussing the issue with Matt, she asks him to paraphrase to see if he can see her perspective. What stage model is Katie and Matt working through? Would it be describing the problem, achieving understanding, identifying goals, or brainstorming solutions? So in this situation, it focuses on how Katie is asking Matt to paraphrase to see if he can see her perspective. So that's not actually, it's definitely not identifying goals, and it's not brainstorming solutions. So you're left between describing the problem and achieving understanding. So within this, you're achieving understanding because they're both trying to become on the same side with their understandings. Obviously, the problem has already been described, and they understand that the problem is that they need to spend more time together. And so that is the reason it would be understanding instead of describing the problem. And so before I move on, one thing I do want to make clear is that this model, yes, it's practical, but like you don't you don't want to be a weirdo about it. Like if you're having a fight with someone, you're not going to be like, okay, sit down, we need to PUGSS it, and like literally go it through step by step, but it is a good model to keep in your head while managing conflict. Just because I think people would probably, depending on the situation and depending on the person and depending on the level of conflict, trying to engage conflict in a very methodological way can sometimes backfire because it feels emotionless. Just as a side note, but this is a great way to kind of think about managing conflict, because I think not enough people recognize that if two parties don't come together on the same page, there can never be a solution. A solution will not come to fruition. And so I think the fact that this model really focuses on mutual understanding, like in the last problem kind of talked about for the answer, I think that is very important to take away. So applying our 5 principles, and as you should remember, our first 6 chapters were over our principles. So how can we apply it to PUGSS? And so for principle 1, you want to have awareness. You want to be aware of your emotions. You want to be aware of your conflict style. Are you aware of your partner's conflict style? And be aware of the message you're conveying. And so that, like I said, the principle 1, awareness. And so moving on to step 2, or the second principle, With verbal messages, you don't want to polarize, you don't want to use trigger words, and not trigger words as in like, ooh, I'm triggered, but like, ooh, you made a low jab that you knew was gonna upset me. Say, going back to the Katie and Matt, I forgot what his name was, but going back to the example that we did for the problem question, say for example, you know, she's like, I just want to spend more time with you and I make time for you. And he's like, well, I just like to get drinks with the boys because you always blah, blah, blah. It's basically just don't make low jabs because you're just going to make the situation worse. Think before you speak. Remember, communication is irreversible. You can't take something back once you said it, even if you say sorry. I heard someone tell a really good metaphor that has to do with this in reference to a hammer. And so, for example, every time you get angry and when you shout, instead of shouting, you go and hammer a nail into a plank of wood. And after there's so many holes in the wood, no matter how well you take the nails out of the plank of wood, there's still going to be holes, there's going to be cracks within that piece of wood. And I would argue that trust and kind of perceptions of people are also like that, you know. Yeah, so just be considerate. Think before you speak. And for nonverbal messages, it's basically just remaining responsive and immediate. If you kind of remember for the regulator nonverbal function, you know, if you're trying to resolve a conflict with someone and if they look irritated, if their leg is twitching, or like thumping where it's like that impatient thump, like this is boring, I want to get it over with, or if you're turned around, if you're not paying attention, if you're on your phone, all of these nonverbals can make a conflict worse, or it won't resolve the conflict. All right, and then responding thoughtfully to others. So it's basically turning off competing messages, observing nonverbal cues, asking appropriate questions, paraphrase, remain nonverbally responsive. So this is just kind of maintaining that open and honest communication. And then the last principle is adapting to others. And so this kind of focuses on differences between messages sent and messages received. And so using perception checking to ensure appropriate interpretations. And so this is just making sure any misunderstandings are cleared out. No one is going away from the situation on different pages. Both parties in the conflict are able to come to a middle spot together. Oh goodness, today is not my day, but I hope that this lecture was easy to watch. We went over conflict, we went over conflict management styles, and we went over managing conflict through PUGSS. This should have been a quicker video to watch, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Although this little Dwight bobblehead might make you feel differently. So this is me and my monster demon in the bathroom signing off.